the first point is that this age of humans is the first time that where humans are beginning to shape events and developments on Earth. And the Earth is 4.5 billion years old. And the humans, the Homo sapiens, as we call ourselves, have been around for 300,000 years. Now, for the first time, we are putting on pressures on this fragile planet in quite irreversible ways. So the year 2020 is the year of the pandemic. It's a once-in-a-century event. But what we have been going through right now, and there's a very famous article in Nature, this prestigious science journal that came out just last week, that sort of was hinting that we're actually living in a once-in-an-epoch era, right? It's a sort of a once-in-an-epoch turning point, where the mass of all human-made materials, bricks and metals, plastic and concrete, exceeds 1.1 trillion tons, and that is more than the combined weight of all life, all plants and animals. All the life-sustaining sort of global nutrient cycles, water, carbon, nitrogen, oxygen, they're all being destabilized in irreversible ways. Within decades, we may lose a quarter of the species on Earth. And if you take the long view, going back 500 million years, there have been 5 previous phases of mass extinction of species. Now the 6th wave of mass extinction will, for the first time, have a non-natural cause, and that cause is us, the humans. Now on the climate, we are altering the climate. We're making severe weather worse. The 2020 Atlantic hurricane season set new records in the number and intensity of storms. And there's all these global and regional effects interacting with each other, right? So the global effect of more heat in the ocean, more heat and vapor in the atmosphere, and vapor, as we all know, is a greenhouse gas trapping. It traps the heat. The regional effects on high pressure centers, the expanses of melting sea ice, the growing cold blob of ocean water south of Greenland, slowing Gulf Stream, disrupted polar vortex. All these things are interacting with each other to really make severe weather worse. And this is what the report starts with, that the amount of pressure that we're exerting on this fragile planet is really unprecedented, really severe. And this is where the proposition is. Of course, the Anthropocene is a proposed geological epoch. We're now in the Holocene, but we may be exiting that and entering this new epoch where these truly unprecedented changes are happening. Now, of course, 2020 was the year of the pandemic. 77 million cases, 1.7 million deaths, sharpest contraction of global incomes and jobs since the 1930s. But at the same time, the vaccines have arrived, but all the virus is also mutating, right? The UK tonight, I don't know if people have been following the news, is on tier 4 lockdown with a new strain of virus that is 70% more transmissible than an earlier strain. So, and the COVID-19, of course, is now broadly acknowledged to have been a result of the way humans have been squeezing local ecosystems, exerting pressure on livestock and wildlife, right? So this unfamiliar pathogen from nature has gone on to lay bare the inequalities in the rest of society. If you look at the graph, there have been minor, in comparison, there are minor dips around 2008, the global financial crisis. 1997, as you can see, there's the Asian financial crisis, minor dips. But look at what is being projected for 2020 and 2021. Truly an unprecedented sort of economic contraction going back almost a century. And the new feature of these kind of shocks is they're all interconnected. So tiny perturbations can morph into contagion, and on the economic sphere, on the environmental sphere, on the viral sphere, as we've been seeing. So this is a big message that we want to highlight. And a lot of the crises are layered, right? It could be an economic crisis, it could be about climate, it could be about pandemics. So this interconnected sort of systemic shocks is what we're dealing with. So the old solutions are no longer good enough. And this is where I think the report does a good job in emphasizing that the planetary and the social imbalances not only reinforce each other, but they exacerbate one another. And we know from the old literature in the 90s and the 2000s, when we focused much more narrowly on the environmental degradation, that also hit the poor very hard. And societies are also being very fragmented. And when societies are fragmented within and beyond nations, collective action becomes very difficult. So the collective action, the solutions that we need to confront pandemics, to confront climate change, becomes much more difficult when there is less solidarity going around. And the nature of these systemic approaches to looking at the challenges is, they exhibit non-linear responses to shocks, right? So even a modest or a small change can lead to the components of the system, resulting in very large changes in the performance of the system as a whole. So this is the challenge we're dealing with. Now, as has been highlighted, Ms. Kani Wignaraja talked about this empty quadrant. And this is really, Human Development Index has evolved over the last 30 years. We have very high human development countries, high human development countries, medium human development countries. What is striking here is if you plot the level of human development on one axis, and on the y-axis, you sort of plot, what was the cost? What was the environmental cost that they have imposed in attaining high human development? There is no country so far that has achieved very high human development status with modest or low material footprint per capita. And this is what we say is the empty quadrant. The path, the development path going forward is to nudge many of these countries to still aspire to reach high human development status, but by imposing very low strains and pressures on the planet. So this is the puzzle of the empty quadrant, and the report does a good job in highlighting that we really need to transform into new pathways. And it is also, this is a human development report after all, and we're not producing yet another sustainability report. So it goes beyond needs and beyond sustaining. A lot of the language in which the issues are packaged is very much true to the original discourse and the original paradigm that Amartya Sen and Mahbub al-Haq presented way back with that first HDR in 1990. It's the language of capabilities, it's the language of agency, it's the language of voice. And this is what, in celebrating the 30th anniversary report, carrying on this very distinguished tradition, we are reinforcing the human development message, but also saying that we need to go beyond now. And this is where the report does a good job in introducing a new index, which I will also touch upon briefly. So the structure is, the first part is renewing the notion of human development to fit the big challenges of our time, the Anthropocene. The second is the emphasis on mechanisms of action, not so much the actors. Of course, the private sector has its role, the government will have to exercise a big role, but the report emphasizes on the mechanisms of action. And this is the way we live, the way we work, the way we cooperate, and all this. And how do we measure all that? So this is the Planetary pressures adjusted human development index that the report presents. Now, the mechanisms for change, the report really highlights 3 avenues. I mean, the report is 400 pages and more, but the emphasis is the central part of the report talks about how we need to change our social norms. And it gives examples about, for example, how during the pandemic, the mask wearing was broadly accepted. That was a social norm in action. Tobacco smoking over decades has now become a taboo. This was sort of leadership and social norms and values evolving to finally acknowledge on a mass scale the challenges that we're dealing with. So the plea here going forward is really to opt a greener way of living, right? Recycling, sharing, and a lot of the onus will be placed on the cities, how we govern cities. Cities already account for 85% of the GDP, 70% of carbon emissions. So the way we design our public transport, the way people cook, the way people consume, the way people commute, this is all going to add up. And each individual sort of micro initiative by each citizen is what's going to coalesce around these country and national commitments. So in the Asia Pacific, we've done a good job in announcing or being part of this global coalition for carbon neutrality by 2050. Big countries, powerful economies, China, Japan, Korea, but even smaller Asia Pacific countries, from Fiji to the Maldives to Nepal, they've all made pledges towards carbon neutrality. But it is really the macro announcements have to be undergirded by our micro behavior, and this is where social norms and values will have to come in. The second powerful sort of mechanism of action is through incentives, right? And the incentives and regulations is where finance will play a key role. Prices have to be right, but there also has to be this inspired motive for collective action, where different constituencies come together. It could be the youth, it could be the different professions really driving change. So how do we incentivize these large pension funds to invest in green renewable technologies? How do we get the price of carbon to truly reflect the social cost that it imposes? Progressive taxation, catastrophic insurance of coastal communities, and removal of fossil fuel subsidies, which the report documents to cost almost $5 trillion annually, which is close to 7% of the global GDP. So there are major reforms, politically unpopular reforms, that we must pursue in the years ahead. And finally, the nature-based solutions is, the report is very passionate about this. The earlier discourse was about the trade-off between people and trees. You pursue economic growth, you become rich, and then you clean up the mess later on. That's not the luxury that we have anymore. So how do you embrace nature in a way that is not constraining your aspirations, higher aspirations for enlarged economic possibilities? So it actually documents almost 20 cost-effective actions related to forests, wetlands, grasslands that can meet 37% of the mitigation needed to cap the global temperature rise within 2 degrees centigrade from pre-industrial levels. And reforestation, that unsung sort of activity, alone accounts for 2/3 of this mitigation potential. So this is a very powerful message, right? That we can enroll nature as our ally. It's no longer this big adversary to this material pursuit of economic growth. And here the report also makes a very poignant point about how we as societies have been doing a very poor job in rewarding the real stewards of nature, right? So there's this example of how the per capita contribution by the indigenous peoples preserving forest storage capacity in the Amazon is roughly equal to per capita greenhouse gas emissions by the top 1% of global emitters. And yet we don't treat that community as well as we should be doing. So this is how the planetary and the social imbalances intersect. And the report does a very good job in highlighting those connections. Let me now briefly touch on the PHDI, the Planetary Health Planetary Pressures Adjusted Human Development Index. As Kanni mentioned, the high human development countries, once you account for the carbon emissions per capita and the material footprint per capita, many of the almost 50 countries that are now in the high human development category drop off. And within Asia, we see that countries like Singapore, like Brunei, suffer a big loss in the rankings once you account for both the production proxy, which is the carbon emissions, and the consumption proxy, which is the material footprint. Now, not all the causes are entirely because of the conscious choices that countries make. Some are beyond their control. Countries like Singapore don't have natural resources. They import almost everything to service not just their native population, but also a large volume of tourists, 3 times their native population and all that. But there are certain policy decisions that are consciously made. So importing and refining crude oil, for example, is a choice that countries make, and that sort of penalizes them from the HDI. So this is this is an experimental index just to raise awareness and to show that there's a better way of doing things possibly. And there are countries in the region, in the Asia Pacific region, which are at very low levels of development now, and with very low carbon footprint and very low material footprint. And this index sort of inspires them to opt for these alternative pathways as well. So finally, the human development as a paradigm, as a development paradigm, and a way of thinking about how we appraise progress, how well countries do in taking care of people's expansion of choices, capabilities, is as relevant as ever. It's just that we are now arguing that these distinct notions of capabilities and agency and values now come together to reorient our approach in the age of humans, and collectively we can pursue solutions that are embedded in changing social norms, in improving incentives, and working with and not against nature. So the overall plea is really the following: people remain, as this 1990 report said, they remain the real wealth of nations. Human development is about nurturing and fulfilling their full potential by investing in capabilities, and they should not be passive recipients. They should be shapers of our shared destiny, and the fate should give way to choices. And as Amartya Sen mentioned, it's exercising our reasoned agency that is what is behind shaping the shared fortunes or shared destiny of all of us. So with that, I conclude the main takeaways from the HDR report.